You've heard preachers, you've heard teachers, and you've read endless debates. But what if I told you the most unexpected words about Jesus aren't in the Bible at all? They're in the Qur'an. When I first read them, I froze. These weren't just verses, they were revelations that left me absolutely speechless. Today, I'm going to share with you exactly what I found and why no Christian, no Muslim, and no seeker of truth can ignore it. For years, I had been told a very simple story: Islam had nothing to say about Jesus, and if it did, it must have been dismissive or even disrespectful. That's what I thought, and honestly, I didn't question it. But when I finally opened the Qur'an and began to read for myself, I was confronted with something completely different. The Jesus described in those pages wasn't ignored. He wasn't dismissed. He wasn't forgotten. Instead, he was honored, respected, and remembered in ways that many sermons and even entire churches had never told me before. What shook me was how clear and direct the verses were. There was no confusion, no mystery clouded in centuries of interpretation. The Qur'an spoke of his miraculous birth, his mission, his miracles, and even his future return, and it did so in words that carried both reverence and power. These weren't just stories, they were declarations of who Jesus truly was in the eyes of God. And in that moment, I realized something that changed the way I saw faith forever. While people argued over doctrines, the Qur'an was quietly protecting the honor of Jesus for over 400 years. It wasn't just about theology anymore, it was about truth, clarity, and respect for a figure both Christians and Muslims deeply love. So if you think you already know Jesus, prepare yourself, because the verses I discovered will not only surprise you, they might just leave you as speechless as they left me. One of the most striking revelations I came across in the Qur'an was how it speaks about the miraculous birth of Jesus. Growing up, I thought this was something only Christianity emphasized, as if Islam had no connection to it. But when I read the Qur'an for myself, I was stunned to see that it not only confirms the virgin birth of Jesus, but honors it in a way that leaves no room for doubt or confusion. The verses describe Mary as chosen above all women, pure and dedicated to God, and then speak of how she gave birth to Jesus without any man touching her, a direct miracle from God himself. This wasn't a story of human invention or imagination, it was a declaration of divine power. What left me speechless was the way the Qur'an describes the moment Jesus was born, and how even as an infant, he spoke words of truth to defend his mother's honor. Imagine that, a newborn child speaking to his people, declaring that he was a servant of God, given a mission and a blessing. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, and it showed me that Islam's respect for Jesus wasn't shallow. It went deep into his story, preserving details that highlighted his purity, his innocence, and the divine signs surrounding his life. This completely broke the stereotype I had in my mind. I had been told Islam somehow downplayed Jesus, but here it was doing the opposite, elevating his miraculous birth as one of the greatest signs of God's power. It wasn't just about Mary or about a child being born. It was about God showing the world that he can create in ways beyond human understanding. That truth alone left me shaken, realizing the Qur'an wasn't erasing Jesus. It was protecting his honor. Another powerful truth I discovered in the Qur'an was how it portrays Jesus as a prophet and messenger of God, not as divine. At first, this challenged everything I thought I knew because I had been raised to see Jesus as more than human. But when I read the Qur'an's words, it didn't feel like a denial. It felt like a restoration of clarity. The verses describe Jesus as one of the greatest messengers, chosen to guide his people back to the worship of one true God. He wasn't presented as less important, but rather as someone whose greatness lay in his mission, his miracles, and his obedience to God. This struck me deeply because it removed the confusion I had always felt. In church, I often wrestled with the idea of Jesus being both God and man. It never fully made sense to me. But the Qur'an showed me something far more beautiful. Jesus didn't have to be God to be honored. He was honored because he lived in full submission to God, delivering his message with truth and power. That realization lifted a huge weight from my heart. What really stood out was how Islam placed Jesus in the same line as other great prophets: Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad. It wasn't diminishing him, but showing that he was part of a divine chain of guidance that God has always sent to humanity. To me, that made Jesus' role even greater because he was not an isolated figure. He was part of a bigger plan that stretched across history. Reading this, I realized that Islam hadn't hidden Jesus, nor had it rejected him. It had preserved his real mission, to call people back to God alone. That truth was more powerful than anything I had ever been told before. One of the most striking discoveries I made in the Qur'an was how it defends the honor of Jesus and his mother, Mary, in a way I had never seen before. Growing up, I often heard arguments or mockery aimed at Mary's purity, and sometimes even whispers that questioned her character. But when I opened the Qur'an, I was stunned. It not only affirmed her innocence, but lifted her to a level of respect I had never witnessed anywhere else. Entire passages are dedicated to Mary, describing her as chosen, purified, and honored above all women of the world. The Qur'an tells the story of Jesus' miraculous birth with such dignity and clarity that it removes any shadow of doubt or disrespect. It describes how Mary withdrew from her people, how she endured the incredible test of carrying Jesus without a father, and how God himself defended her when people accused her. When I read the verse where baby Jesus speaks from the cradle to declare his role and defend his mother's honor, I was left completely speechless. It was as if the Qur'an was saying, no human being should ever doubt the purity of Mary or the miracle of Jesus. This moved me in a way I didn't expect, because I realized Islam was protecting not just the truth about Jesus, but also the dignity of his mother, something that Christianity, at times, has struggled to uphold in practice. To see a book revealed over 400 years ago, standing as a shield against false accusations and giving Mary and Jesus their rightful honor was eye-opening. It wasn't just theology anymore, it was living proof of how God preserves the truth, no matter how much time passes or how much distortion creeps in. Another powerful truth I uncovered in the Qur'an was how it completely rewrites the story of the crucifixion. For my entire life, I was taught that Jesus was crucified, that this was the centerpiece of faith, and that everything depended on that moment. But when I read the Qur'an, I found something so different, and yet so profound. It says clearly that Jesus was not crucified, nor was he killed. Instead, it says it only appeared that way to the people. At first, this stunned me. How could such a central event be told so differently? But the more I reflected, the more it made sense. The Qur'an's account preserves the honor of Jesus by protecting him from humiliation and death at the hands of his enemies. It describes how God raised him up, saving him from their plot, and how his mission did not end in defeat, but in victory. For me, this changed everything, because for so long, I struggled with the idea of God allowing his beloved messenger to suffer such a brutal, humiliating death. The Qur'an gave me a perspective that aligned far more with God's justice and mercy. What also struck me was how this view removes confusion about salvation. Instead of relying on someone else's death for forgiveness, Islam teaches that every person is responsible for their own actions and that God forgives directly without intermediaries. That truth felt liberating. It shifted the focus from despair to hope, from guilt to personal accountability. Reading this, I realized the Qur'an wasn't diminishing Jesus' story at all. It was restoring it. It was showing that Jesus was protected, honored, and taken back to God in dignity, not left to die on a cross. That perspective didn't weaken my faith. It gave it new strength, because it revealed a God who is truly just and merciful. What left me in awe the most was the Qur'an's teaching that Jesus is still alive and will one day return. I had always thought of Jesus' story as something that ended 2,000 years ago, sealed in the past. But the Qur'an presents a completely different picture, one of continuity, purpose, and a future that hasn't yet unfolded. It says Jesus was not killed, he was not crucified, but instead, God raised him up. This idea transformed the way I saw him, because it meant his mission wasn't over. It was preserved for a final chapter. The thought that Jesus is alive right now, protected by God, felt overwhelming. It made me realize that his role in history isn't finished, and that humanity hasn't yet seen the completion of his journey. According to Islamic belief, Jesus will return before the end of time, not with a new message, but to reaffirm the same truth he always carried, that there is only one God, and that people must worship him alone. This detail struck me with a force I couldn't ignore, because it placed Jesus at the heart of humanity's ultimate destiny. For me, this was both humbling and inspiring. Humbling, because it showed that God's plan is bigger than anything I had imagined. Inspiring, because it showed that Jesus' life is not a closed book. He remains a living part of God's promise to guide humanity. Unlike the image I grew up with of a defeated figure on a cross, the Quran paints him as alive, protected, and destined to return with honor. That truth didn't just change how I saw Jesus. It changed how I saw history itself. It made me realize that we're all still part of a story that's not yet finished, and Jesus' return will be a reminder of the timeless truth that God's guidance never fails. So after everything I've shared, one thing becomes crystal clear. The Quran does not dismiss Jesus. It honors him in ways many people never imagined. It defends his mother's purity, preserves his true mission, protects him from humiliation, and reminds us that his story is not over. The picture of Jesus in Islam is not one of rejection, but of respect, dignity, and truth. And for me, that realization was life-changing. When I first opened the Quran, I expected distance. I expected it to minimize or erase Jesus. Instead, I found the opposite. Verses that lifted him, verses that clarified his role, and verses that restored the honor that centuries of confusion had clouded. It was like rediscovering a hidden treasure that had been waiting all along. And this isn't just a matter of theology. This is about truth. Because if the Quran has preserved what others changed, if it has safeguarded the words in honor of a man as great as Jesus, then what else does it preserve? What else has it protected for over 400 years that the world desperately needs today? That question is too big to ignore. Whether you're Christian, Muslim, or someone just searching for answers, you owe it to yourself to read the Quran with your own eyes. Don't take my word for it. Don't rely only on what others have told you. Go to the source, because inside you may find what I found: a book that doesn't just talk about God, but one that defends the truth about his prophets, including Jesus. And maybe, like me, you'll walk away realizing that the honor of Jesus was never lost. It was protected all along in the Quran.